The smallest act of kindness can become the biggest turning point in a life you never knew existed. On a Friday evening in February, snow came down over Winter Street in East Baltimore so heavily that the traffic light at the end of the block had blurred into nothing, and Meredith Quaintance stood under the bus shelter waiting for the last run of the night. Holding the graded workbooks of 34 third graders, she had finished marking in a classroom where the heat had already been shut off for the weekend. Her phone had 9% left. She was working out whether this month's paycheck should cover the electric bill first or the rent first when she noticed him, a man in a dark coat, standing perfectly still in the middle of all that hurrying, snow gathering on his shoulders, and he did not bother to brush it away. He had already asked the clerk inside the store that had lost power. He had already tried the payphone on the corner, the one that had not worked in years. Then he moved down the line of people under the shelter, asking each of them the same short question, and one after another they turned away before he could finish it. Some shook their heads, others tightened their grip on their phones and looked somewhere else. He never argued with anyone. He simply said thank you and moved on. By the time he reached Meredith, there was nothing between them but the sound of falling snow. "I only need 20 seconds, he said. She looked at her screen. 8%. Somewhere in her memory, her husband's voice reminded her that kindness always costs a little something. 20 seconds, she said, and handed it over. He dialed from memory without searching his contacts. He said exactly 7 words. Then he gave the phone back. And in that moment, Meredith saw the one thing nobody else on that street saw: the hands of the calmest man on the block were shaking. Less than a minute later, 3 black cars turned onto Winter Street, and men in dark suits stepped out into the snow holding umbrellas, and not one of them moved until he gave the smallest nod. "One day," he told her, "I hope I have the chance to return this." Meredith was certain she would never see him again. Unfortunately for her, less than 2 miles away, the man in the back of the lead car was already asking for her name, and his was a name this entire city had learned never to say out loud. If this story reached you, leave a like so we know you're listening. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness is still out there. And subscribe so the next story finds you too. The last bus arrived more than 20 minutes late, and by the time Meredith stepped off at the corner of East Lombard Street, the snow had risen above her ankles. She walked another 4 blocks, clutching the stack of notebooks against her chest to shield herself from the wind, then climbed 3 flights of stairs, passing through darkness on the 2nd floor landing, because the light bulb had burned out in November and no one had replaced it. The apartment was cold. She didn't turn on the heat. She set the notebooks on the kitchen table, hung her coat over the back of a chair to dry, then took 3 envelopes from the top drawer, kept there out of a habit she had carried with her since her mother was alive. The first envelope was marked electricity. The second was marked rent. The third had nothing written on it, and inside were $41 she had saved for things without names. Her paycheck that month had been delayed by 2 days because of the federal holiday. She sat down, opened the pocket calculator her students were always borrowing, and did the same calculation she had done every month for the past 3 years. The electric bill was $184. The rent was $950. The total amount in her account, after setting aside transportation costs for the entire month, was $962. She sat with that number for a very long time. Her landlord was an old man who lived on the ground floor, and in 3 years he had never once knocked on her door to ask for the rent before the 10th. There weren't any old men at the electric company. Meredith put $184 into the first envelope and sealed it, then wrote a small line in pencil on the second envelope, "Pay the rest on the 15th, and placed them both back in the drawer. She reheated the soup left over from the day before, ate it standing over the sink, then sat down and finished grading the 7 remaining notebooks. When she reached Tamsin Reyes's, she paused a little longer. The girl had spelled every word correctly, but her handwriting grew smaller toward the bottom of the page, as though the more she wrote, the more afraid she became that someone might read it. Meredith drew a star in the margin and wrote beside it, "I know you can do it." Outside the window, snow continued falling over Winter Street, and she didn't think about the man at the bus stop at all. She plugged her phone into the charger, watched the 8% begin to climb, then went to bed. At that same moment, nearly 4 miles south of her apartment, in a room on the 9th floor of a building overlooking Baltimore Harbor, Ruslan Andrić set a thin file on the oak table and pushed it toward the man standing with his back turned. The file was only about the thickness of a finger. There was nothing written on its cover. Ruslan had been doing this work for 31 years, under 2 generations of masters, and he knew the procedure so well that he no longer had to think about it. Whenever a stranger came into contact with this world, they had to know who that person was. Not to do anything, just to know. That was how Augustine's father had taught him, and how Augustine's grandfather had taught his father. Across 3 generations, not a single loose end had ever been left unresolved. Her name is Meredith Quaintance, Ruslan said. 27 years old. Everything is in here. Augustin Volkov didn't turn around immediately. He remained where he was, looking down at the black water below, where the crane stood motionless beneath the snow. From the moment he left the hospital room at 11 o'clock that night until now, he hadn't spoken more than 5 sentences to anyone. The thin scar along his left cheekbone had turned pale beneath the light, as it always did when he was tired. Then he turned, walked to the table, and looked at the file for exactly 3 seconds. Ruslan waited. He had prepared answers to every possible question. What she did for a living, who she lived with, whether she had connections to anyone, whether someone had paid her to stand at that bus stop that night. He wasn't prepared for what happened next. Augustin placed 2 fingers on the cover of the file and pushed it back across the table toward Ruslan until it stopped directly in front of his hand. "Do nothing," he said. Ruslan didn't understand. "Sir, don't open it. Don't read it. Don't keep it." His voice didn't rise even slightly. She helped a man without needing to know who he was. "Leave it that way." Ruslan stood still. In 31 years, he had heard many orders in that room, and nearly all of them had been orders telling him to do something. This was the first time he had ever heard an order telling him not to. "What if she remembers your face?" he asked carefully. "You were alone last night. No one was with you. She looked at you for nearly a minute beneath that streetlight." Augustin removed his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down. "Then she remembers my face. You know what that means." "I know." He reached for the stack of harbor documents that had been lying there since the previous afternoon, untouched because no one had dared move them. "Do you know how many people were standing beneath that shelter last night, Ruslan?" 9. I asked all 9 of them. 8 turned away. The 9th had 8% battery left, and still handed me her phone. He opened the stack of papers and searched for the page he needed. "If I send people to investigate her now, I will erase with my own hands the only thing I learned last night." Ruslan picked up the file. It was lighter than he had expected. "I'll put it away," he said. "Don't put it away. Get rid of it." He nodded and walked out. But after the door had closed behind him and he was standing alone in the hallway, Ruslan Andrić did something for which he would later pay a price. He didn't dispose of the file. He carried it down to the 7th floor, placed it in the bottom drawer of the steel cabinet in his private office, and locked it away. He told himself he was doing it for his master's safety, and for the most part, that was true. Unfortunately for all of them, the file had been compiled long before the night of the blizzard, and inside it was a name Augustin Volkov should have read that very evening. At 7:15 on Monday morning, the lights were already on in classroom number 4 at Fell Point Elementary School, while the entire hallway outside remained dark. Meredith had arrived 45 minutes before she was required to, as she had done since the beginning of the school year, and by 7:15, 11 children were sitting around 2 tables pushed together in the middle of the room. On the table sat a tray of blueberry muffins cut in half, a large carton of milk, and a stack of paper cups the children passed among themselves. The name Breakfast Club had been invented by a boy back in September, and ever since then it had remained written in colored chalk in the corner of the board, untouched by anyone. The club had only 2 rules. Whoever arrived first poured milk for whoever came later, and every morning, one person read a page aloud, while everyone else had to listen. "Whose turn is it today?" Meredith asked, and 8 hands shot up at once, accompanied by the scraping of chairs and at least 3 voices insisting that they had been unfairly skipped the previous Friday. She let the noise continue for a few more seconds before tapping twice on the tabletop, and the room fell silent immediately, not because the children were afraid, but because it was a familiar game between them. She looked around the table. Tamsin Reyes sat at the far end on the left, both hands wrapped tightly around her cup of milk, the only child who hadn't raised her hand. The girl never raised her hand. In 7 months of school, Tamsin hadn't read aloud in front of the class even once, and Meredith had learned early that every word of encouragement only made the child draw further into herself, so she didn't ask. She simply called on the boy sitting beside her, handed him the book, then turned to Tamsin and said in the most ordinary voice in the world, "I need someone to turn the pages. He reads so fast he can't keep up with them." Tamsin looked at her for a second, then pulled her chair closer. The first page passed beneath the boy's stumbling voice and the soft rustle of paper beneath Tamsin's fingers, and halfway through the second page, when he misread the word cat as catch, and the whole table burst into laughter, Tamsin laughed too. Meredith saw it and said nothing. She didn't praise her, didn't point it out, didn't turn it into a lesson. She only poured a little more milk into the girl's cup, then walked away to get a cloth for the table. Some things disappeared the moment they were given a name. At 7:55, the bell rang, and the 11 children poured into the hallway, leaving behind an empty muffin tray and 11 paper cups that, according to the rules, would have to be cleared away by whoever arrived first the next morning. Meredith cleared them away. She always did. The rest of the day passed in the rhythm she had grown so accustomed to that she no longer felt it. 34 children, 4 lessons, a 20-minute department meeting that accomplished nothing, and an afternoon spent grading papers in a classroom where the heat had been turned off since 3 o'clock. At 5, she locked the classroom door and walked to the grocery store at the corner of East Baltimore Street and Highland, where she stopped every Monday because that was the day they marked down the bread. In line ahead of her stood an elderly woman with only 6 items in her cart. The woman swiped her card once, then twice, then a third time, and each time the machine gave a small sound that everyone standing nearby could hear. The elderly woman began pointing to the items on the conveyor belt one by one and telling the cashier to take this one off, and this one too. Her voice remained perfectly calm, but her hands didn't. By the third item, Meredith stepped forward. She didn't say anything to the woman. She handed her own card to the cashier and said quietly, "Please put all of it on this," then stepped half a pace back and looked away, because she knew exactly what it felt like to have a stranger look directly into your face at a moment like that. The woman turned around, about to say something. Meredith only gave the slightest shake of her head and smiled, the smile of someone in a hurry, then picked up her bag of bread, wished the woman a good evening, and walked out before she could ask her name. The total was $29. On the walk home, the snow had melted into gray slush along the curb, and the wind coming in from the harbor blew against her so hard that she had to pull her collar up to her chin. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, opened the door, hung her coat over the back of the chair, and sat down at the kitchen table with her wallet in her hand. She counted. $11. That was all she had left until Saturday morning, when the second paycheck was deposited. She sat staring at the 3 bills and the handful of coins on the wooden tabletop for long enough that anyone watching would have assumed the woman was filled with regret. Then she opened the drawer, took out the hardbound notebook she used to record the things she needed to do for her class, turned to the page for that week, and added one final line at the bottom in pencil. "Buy more milk, Monday." She underlined the words twice, closed the notebook, and went to heat the remaining soup. 4 miles away, in a room on the 9th floor overlooking Baltimore Harbor, a man had just finished his 4th meeting of the day and was standing alone by the window, watching the stream of headlights moving along the waterfront. He didn't ask anyone anything about the teacher from the bus stop. He had given an order, and he believed that order had been obeyed. Unfortunately for him, on the 7th floor of that same building, a steel cabinet remained locked, and the man holding the key had just decided that there were some things his master was better off never knowing. The truth came apart on Thursday afternoon, and it came apart because of a single sheet of paper no one was supposed to notice. Once a week, the operations department sent the 9th floor an expense report covering every vehicle in the entire system, and Augustin Volkov was the only man in 3 generations of his family who actually read it from beginning to end. He wasn't looking for anything. He simply had a habit of reading the things other people believed weren't worth reading. On the second page, there was a line recording 27 hours of idling time for a vehicle without company plates, registered in East Baltimore, spread across 9 consecutive days. He looked at that line for a long time. 27 hours of waiting in East Baltimore were 27 hours he had never ordered. He summoned Ruslan Andrić to the 9th floor, and Ruslan came immediately, because he always came immediately. Augustin didn't show him the paper. He asked only one question. Who has been parking at the corner of East Lombard Street for 9 days straight? Ruslan stood there, and for the space of 3 breaths, he could have lied. He had been doing this work for 31 years, and he knew at least 4 ways to lie in answer to that question that no one could ever verify. But he looked at the man sitting behind the desk, the man he had once carried in his arms when the boy was only 2 years old, and he chose another path. "My men," he said, "since last Saturday morning." The room went silent. Augustin didn't rise. He didn't raise his voice. He merely lowered his right hand onto the oak desk, palm down, very slowly, and left it resting there. Ruslan had seen that gesture exactly 4 times in his life, and all 4 had been on evenings after which someone left the city forever. He straightened his back. "I told you to do nothing," Augustin said. "Yes." "I told you to dispose of the file." "Yes." "You told me you would." "I said I would put it away," Ruslan replied. "You told me to get rid of it." "I didn't." He didn't lower his eyes. That was the only reason Augustin remained seated. "Do you want the real reason or the respectable one?" "The real reason." Ruslan stepped forward. "Last Friday night, you stood alone on Winter Street for 40 minutes. No car, no me, no one at all. During those 40 minutes, you approached 9 strangers and asked to borrow a phone, and you stood beneath a streetlight close enough for every one of them to see your face clearly." His voice remained steady, but it hardened. "Your father died one morning because he walked 30 yards from the church door to his car without anyone going ahead of him. 30 yards, sir. You stood in the street for 40 minutes. I wasn't watching her. I was watching the opening you left behind." Augustin listened to every word. He didn't interrupt once. When Ruslan finished, Augustin lifted his hand from the desk and sat upright, and when he spoke, his voice was even lower than before. "You're right about the opening," he said, "and you're wrong about how to close it." He rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the traffic moving along the waterfront. 9 people stood beneath that shelter, Ruslan. 8 protected their phones. The 9th protected a stranger. "Do you understand how rare that is?" Ruslan didn't answer. "She didn't know who I was. She still doesn't. And as long as she doesn't know, what she did that night remains untouched." He turned around. "If I put men in a car outside her building for 9 days, then I've turned an act of kindness into a file. And once it becomes a file, it can never become what it was again." Ruslan opened his mouth to speak about the risk one more time, but Augustin raised a hand. "Erase everything. Every photograph. Every note. Every travel log. Every word your men wrote during those 9 days. I want it gone from the system before midnight tonight. And the file in the cabinet?" Augustin paused for a single beat. Later, when Ruslan remembered that moment, he would understand that it had been a fork in the road, and both men had chosen the wrong direction. "You locked it in your steel cabinet," Augustin said. "Then leave it there. Keep it locked. Don't give it to me. And don't give it to anyone else." He looked directly into the old man's eyes. "People deserve privacy when they choose kindness. If I can't preserve that principle for a teacher I met for only 40 seconds, then I can't preserve it for anyone." Ruslan nodded. That night, everything was erased exactly as ordered, and his men left the corner of East Lombard Street before 9 o'clock, and not a single line bearing Meredith Quaintance's name remained anywhere in the Volkov family system. That same night, Meredith came home later than usual because the parent-teacher conference had run long, and she stopped at the row of mailboxes in the apartment lobby, as she did every day. Inside her box were 2 bills, a laundromat advertisement, and a white envelope thicker than everything else, with no stamp, no return address, and only her name handwritten across the front in black ink. She opened it at the foot of the stairs. There was no letter inside. There was only a dark blue plastic card from the Enoch Pratt Free Library, the kind of lifetime membership card she had seen in brochures several times and had never considered for herself. Already embossed with her name, already activated, valid forever. Behind the card was a small slip of paper, written in the same black ink, containing a single line. "Every story deserves another chapter." There was no signature. Meredith turned the paper over. The other side was blank. She stood there for a long time at the bottom of the dark staircase, then slipped the card into her wallet, between her teacher identification card and the $11 she had left, and climbed 3 flights of stairs without once thinking about the man on Winter Street, because in her mind, that story had ended 10 days earlier. Unfortunately for her, the person who had written that line had never spoken her name to anyone since the night of the blizzard, and that was precisely why no one in that building, with its 9th floor overlooking the harbor, knew the envelope had ever been sent. The notice came on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, and it arrived the way things like that always did, which meant no one was warned beforehand, and everyone learned at the same time. At 3:20, after the last bus had left the schoolyard and the hallways had emptied, Priscilla Whatley had a sheet of paper posted on the door of the teacher's lunchroom with 3 handwritten words, all staff meeting, 3:45. 22 people attended. The Fell Point lunchroom was a long, narrow room at the end of the building, with 4 plastic tables and a microwave whose timer button had been broken since fall, and in March it was the coldest room in the entire school, because the heating pipes ended just before they reached it. Priscilla closed the door behind her. She had been principal of the school for 19 years, and had taught there for 11 years before that, and everyone could see that she was holding the paper with both hands, something she never did. She gave no introduction. She read it exactly as written. The Baltimore City Board of Education, after receiving the structural survey conducted by an independent firm in January, has determined that the main building of Fell Point Elementary School requires reinforcement of its foundation and load-bearing framework at an estimated cost of $4,200,000. The capital construction budget for the current fiscal year has been fully allocated. No additional funding is available. Therefore, the board has voted to discontinue operations at Fell Point Elementary School at the end of the academic year and to reassign all students among 3 receiving schools. Priscilla read the names of the 3 schools, then read their distances as well, because she knew those were the numbers that truly mattered. The first school was 2.5 miles away. The second was 3.8 miles away. The third was 4.1 miles away, on the other side of the highway. She placed the paper on the table. "That's everything," she said. "I found out at 11 o'clock this morning. I called them 3 times before I put the notice on the door." No one answered. No one said anything. Among the 22 people sitting in that cold room were teachers who had worked at Fell Point longer than most of the students had been alive, and others who had been there for only a year and a half, and both groups were silent in exactly the same way. A first-grade teacher quietly asked whether anyone would be allowed to keep their job, and Priscilla answered that staff would be considered for reassignment to the receiving schools according to seniority, and that she couldn't promise anything to anyone. Someone else asked whether the decision could be appealed. Priscilla said there would be a public hearing at the end of April, lasting 90 minutes, and that in her 19 years as principal, she had attended 4 such hearings, and had never once seen a decision reversed. $4 million too, the physical education teacher said. No one has $4 million too. After that, no one asked another question. People began looking down at the tables or out the window, and several had already started calculating the distance from their homes to the 3 other schools. The silence wasn't the silence of outrage. It was the silence of people who had lived long enough to understand that some decisions were made in places their voices could never reach. Then Meredith stood up. She hadn't intended to stand. She was sitting at the end of the 3rd table, still holding the stack of notebooks from that afternoon, and she was on her feet before she had time to think about what she would say. "Has anyone on that board ever set foot inside this building?" she asked. Priscilla looked at her. "Who?" "The people who voted, the 9 board members. Has even one of those 9 ever walked through the front doors of this school?" Priscilla didn't answer immediately, and the absence of an answer was an answer in itself. 4.1 miles, Meredith said. "Across the highway. I have 11 children who come to my classroom at 7:15 every morning because they can walk here. Not one of them can walk 4.1 miles. That means they will have to get on a bus at 6 o'clock. It means their mornings will disappear." She looked around the room. "I don't know what 4 million too looks like. I've never seen that much money, and I don't know anyone who has it, but I do know that if none of us speaks at that hearing, the only number they will hear is 4 million too, and they will go home believing they made the right decision." Someone at the far end of the table quietly said that nothing could be done in 90 minutes. Meredith turned toward them. "Nothing," she replied. "But if no one stands up and speaks, then later we won't have anything to tell the children about what we did with those 90 minutes. She sat down. No one applauded, because this wasn't the kind of room where people applauded. But Priscilla Whatley picked up the paper, folded it in half, and said she would reserve a speaking slot at the hearing at the end of April, and that anyone who wished to speak should write their name on the list she would leave on her desk beginning the next morning. The meeting ended at 4:10. On the way out, Priscilla stopped Meredith at the door. "Do you understand what you just volunteered to do?" she asked. Meredith said she did. The principal studied her for a moment, then said, 90 minutes divided among everyone who signs up. You will have 4 minutes at most." Meredith nodded and stepped into the hallway. That night, she sat at her kitchen table until after 11 o'clock, writing out her 4 minutes on paper, tearing them up, then writing them again. She had no idea that during that same week, In a meeting on the 9th floor of a building overlooking the harbor, the name of the school she was trying to save had been read aloud once, buried among a list of 17 other real estate addresses, and the man seated at the head of the table had turned the page without pausing. 9 days after the meeting in the teacher's lunchroom, a man in a delivery uniform walked into the Fell Point school office at 10 o'clock in the morning and asked to place an envelope directly into Meredith Quaintance's hands, not leave it in the mail tray and not give it to anyone else. She was teaching her third lesson of the day. The students had to be given a 10-minute writing assignment so she could go downstairs and sign for it. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, with the name of a foundation she had never heard of embossed across the front, the East Harbor Foundation for Community Education, and inside was an invitation to the East Baltimore Educator Appreciation Dinner to be held the following Saturday evening at an old hotel on Charles Street. Formal attire requested. Transportation was available for invited guests who registered in advance. The guest list was private. Meredith read it twice, then carried it to the principal's office because she was certain there had been a mistake. Priscilla Watley took the invitation, read it, then turned it over to see whether anything else had been written on the back. "It isn't a mistake," she said. "You're the only person in this school who has refused every penny of the morning club stipend for 3 years in a row. That is in your record, whether you wanted it there or not." Meredith said she saw no reason to attend a dinner at a hotel while the school was preparing to close. Priscilla placed the invitation on the desk and pushed it back toward her. "At the end of April, you will have 4 minutes before the city board," she said. "Who do you think will be sitting in that dining room? They are the people whose telephone calls those 9 board members have to answer. You want to save this school? Don't spend all your time rehearsing 4 minutes. Go to the dinner." That was why Meredith found herself at the hotel on Charles Street that Saturday evening. She hadn't registered for transportation. She took the light rail and walked 2 blocks, wearing the gray dress she had bought 6 years earlier for a wedding and had worn exactly 3 times since then, most recently to a funeral home. She arrived 20 minutes early and stood at the edge of the lobby for a while before going inside, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was calculating what time she would get home if she caught the last train. Inside, someone handed her a name tag and a folded program. She took both without looking at them, slipped the program into her purse, and walked straight to table number 22 at the back of the room, because that was the number printed on her tag, and because it was also the table farthest from the stage. Within half an hour, the ballroom was full. There were teachers, librarians, several people from community organizations whose faces she recognized, and another group entirely, people dressed in expensive clothes who shook hands with one another in the practiced manner of people accustomed to shaking hands. Meredith listened as 2 people at her table spoke about how their school was also waiting for a structural report, and she told them everything about Fell Point without leaving anything out, and one of them said this was exactly the right place to talk about it. At 7:40, the lights in the room dimmed. The host thanked the guests, mentioned that the foundation was entering its 4th year, then said he would like to invite the foundation's principal benefactor to deliver the opening remarks. Meredith was reaching for her glass of water. Applause rose around the room, but there was something about it that didn't sound like ordinary applause. It began too evenly and ended too quickly, as though everyone in the room knew precisely how long they were supposed to clap. She looked up. The man who stepped onto the stage was about 6 feet tall, with closely cut black hair and a dark suit that seemed deliberately unremarkable, and he approached the microphone with the exact same stride she had seen on Winter Street when he walked along the line of people beneath the bus shelter. The thin scar along his left cheekbone was clear beneath the stage lights. Meredith sat perfectly still. Her hand remained on the glass of water. In 3 seconds, she tried 3 different explanations, and all 3 collapsed, because she had studied that face beneath a streetlight for nearly a minute, and she knew she wasn't mistaken. She took the program from her purse, opened it beneath the table, and found the small printed line beneath the heading for the opening remarks, Augustin Volkov. She read the name, and it meant nothing to her. It was only a name, 2 words printed in black ink on white paper, but when she looked up from the page, she understood something else, something she would remember for a very long time afterward. The entire ballroom was silent. 300 people, dozens of tables, knives and forks that only moments earlier had been striking plates with soft, metallic sounds, and now there wasn't a single noise. No one cleared their throat. No one shifted a chair. No one reached for a glass of wine. Meredith had attended enough ceremonies in her life to know what polite silence sounded like, and she knew the silence of respect, And this was neither of those things. This was the kind of silence people kept when they didn't want to be the person who made a sound. The man at the podium spoke briefly. He said cities weren't changed by the people who had the most money, but by the people who continued arriving at school 45 minutes early, when no one paid them a penny more for doing it. He thanked them, then stepped away from the podium, and the applause rose evenly once more before ending just as quickly as it had before. The woman sitting beside Meredith leaned over and whispered something to the person on her other side, and Meredith caught only the final 3 words. "Don't say his name." She looked down at the program again. The man who had stood in the snow asking to borrow 20 seconds. The man whose hand had trembled. The man 8 people before her had turned away from. The man she had been certain she would never see again. Unfortunately for her, this was only the evening she learned his name, and it would take many more months before that name finally told her what it meant. The program continued for another 40 minutes with presentations Meredith barely heard, because throughout those 40 minutes she did nothing but calculate when it would be polite for her to stand up and leave. They gave a certificate to a librarian who had worked for 26 years at the Canton branch, to a middle school principal, and to a group of 3 teachers who taught English to newly arrived immigrants. Meredith applauded every time she was supposed to. Then the host said the final part of the evening was reserved for people whose work no one ever saw, and he read 4 names. Hers was the 3rd. She remained seated for exactly 1 beat, long enough for the woman beside her to touch her elbow and whisper that he meant her. Meredith stood. The distance from table 22 to the stage was the longest distance she had ever crossed inside a room, and she walked it in a gray dress that was 6 years old, through 300 people, with only one thought in her mind, that no one would look down at her shoes. The other 3 recipients accepted their certificates from the host. When Meredith's turn came, he stepped back half a pace and announced that the final award would be presented personally by the foundation's benefactor. Cameras clicked. Augustin Volkov stepped forward, and from 3 feet away beneath the stage lights, he looked nothing like the man in the snow. He extended his hand. She shook it, and he didn't hold on for a second longer than necessary. Then he gave her a small wooden box, only slightly larger than her hand, and as he passed it to her, he said something quietly enough that only she could hear it beneath the applause rising around them. Some acts of kindness can't be forgotten. Meredith looked directly into his face. She wanted to ask him many things, and she couldn't ask any of them, because 300 people were watching, and because she understood that there were questions that would be ruined if they were asked here. She only thanked him. He nodded, stepped back, and the entire exchange was over in 9 seconds. She returned to her seat, sat down, and didn't open the wooden box until the dinner had ended and she was standing alone in the hallway near the exit. Inside, resting on velvet, was a brass key. It wasn't a replica. It was a real key, old-fashioned, with a long stem and a round head, heavier than she had expected. A small sentence had been engraved along its length. "Kindness travels farther than we can see." There was no logo, no foundation name, no date. Meredith turned it over beneath the hallway light, searching the back, but the back was blank as well. She closed the box, placed it in her purse, and walked outside. It was 10:20. The last light rail train on her route had departed at 10:15, and she realized this while standing at the corner of Charles Street, looking at the transit app on her phone with 14% battery remaining. The alternate route required 3 transfers, and wouldn't bring her to the end of her street until nearly midnight. She was trying to decide whether walking to the central station would be faster when a black sedan pulled to the curb in front of her, and the driver stepped out, walked around the front of the car, and stopped far enough away that he wouldn't startle her. "Miss Acquaintance," he said. "Mr. Volkov asked me to take you home. There are no obligations. It's only an offer." Meredith looked at the car. Then she looked down Charles Street, where the wind was blowing up from the harbor, and a cold rain had begun to fall. She was 27, though in her mind she felt 37, and she was tired enough to understand that refusing a ride at 10:20 at night merely to prove something to herself wasn't pride. It was foolishness. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The driver opened the rear door for her. She got in, placed her purse on her lap, and for the first 3 minutes, no one spoke. Then she looked up at the rearview mirror. "You know how to get to East Lombard Street, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then let me out at the corner of Lombard and Chester Street." The driver lifted his eyes slightly. "Your address is 3 blocks beyond that." "I know," Meredith said. "Let me out there." He asked no further questions. The car traveled through the wet city for 20 minutes, and when they reached the corner of Lombard and Chester, Meredith opened her purse, took out the wooden box, checked that it was still there, then stepped from the car. She thanked the driver twice and walked the final 3 blocks through the cold rain, holding her purse against her chest, exactly as she did every night. Not a single window on her street saw the black car. 40 minutes later, in a room on the 9th floor overlooking the harbor, Ruslan Andrić reported the entire matter in 3 sentences, because he always reported everything in 3 sentences. She accepted the ride. She asked to be let out 3 blocks from her home. She walked the rest of the way in the rain. Augustin Volkov was standing beside the window, his suit jacket removed and draped over the back of a chair. When Ruslan finished, he remained silent longer than the older man expected. "Would you like me to have someone check the area?" Ruslan asked. 3 blocks at night. No. Augustin turned around. "Do you understand why she did it?" Ruslan said he assumed she didn't want anyone to see her arriving in an expensive car. "Almost," Augustin said. "But it wasn't shame. She lives there. She walks that street every day. If her neighbors saw a car like that stop outside her building tonight, they would ask questions tomorrow, make guesses next week, and by next month she would become a story in her own neighborhood." He picked up his suit jacket. "She accepts help, but she doesn't accept attention. Very few people understand the difference." Ruslan nodded and committed the words to memory, because 31 years in his profession had taught him that when his master began explaining a stranger to him, that stranger had stopped being a stranger a long time ago. Unfortunately for both of them, during that very same week, the bid for the structural reinforcement of an elementary school on the east side had been submitted to the city board, and no one in that building with its 9th floor overlooking the harbor knew that the number written inside it would soon make the entire city of Baltimore ask the same question. The news reached the school on Thursday morning, and it arrived by a route no one had expected, through a reporter. At 9:15, a young woman from the local newspaper called the office landline and asked whether the principal had any comment on the city board placing Fell Point back on its agenda. Priscilla Whatley replied that she didn't know what the reporter was talking about, and the woman on the other end of the line fell silent for several seconds before saying that perhaps she should call the board first. Priscilla called. This time, someone answered immediately. By 11 o'clock, a copy of the filing had been delivered to the school through the department's internal mail system, 23 pages thick and stamped as received by the Baltimore City Office of Public Procurement. Priscilla read it in her office with the door open, and she read it in the exact order anyone who had worked with public school budgets for 30 years would have read it, which meant she turned directly to the page containing the number before looking at anything else. Page 11. Reinforcement of the Foundation and Load-Bearing Framework. Main Building. Fell Point Elementary School. Includes all materials, labor, permits, liability insurance, and a 10-year structural warranty. Total fixed bid price. $1. Priscilla read the line 3 times. She turned back to the previous page to make sure she hadn't mistaken the column, then flipped to the appendix in search of a hidden clause, an additional charge, an escalation provision, the noose she was certain had to be waiting somewhere. There was none. The filing stated clearly that the contractor accepted full responsibility for all unforeseen costs and could not request a price adjustment under any circumstances. A bank guarantee letter was attached. There was a Class 1 contractor qualification certificate. There were 7 pages of technical drawings, signed by a structural engineer licensed to practice in Maryland. Procedurally, it was the cleanest filing she had ever held in her hands. Only then did Priscilla return to the first page to see who had submitted it. At the top, inside the box marked contractor name, one line appeared in bold print: Volkov Harbor Construction, a member company of Volkov Harbor Trust, Baltimore, Maryland. She set the filing on her desk and remained motionless for a long time. Then she called Meredith down to the office. It was 11:40, in the middle of the 4th lesson, and Meredith came downstairs with a red pen still tucked behind her ear. Priscilla didn't say a word. She only pushed the filing across the desk, already open to page 11, and pointed to one line with the tip of her finger. Meredith bent over and read it. $1, she said. $1, Priscilla replied. $4,200,000 worth of work, with a bid price of $1. Completely valid. The board has placed the dissolution decision back on the agenda because the only reason they gave for closing this school has just disappeared. She turned the filing back to the first page and left it there. Meredith looked at the contractor's name. She said nothing. Priscilla studied her face, and she was a woman who had spent 30 years teaching, which meant she knew how to read many things on another person's face. "You know this name," she said. It wasn't a question. "I met him at the dinner last Saturday," Meredith said. "He was the foundation's benefactor." "Is that all?" Meredith opened her mouth, then closed it again. She thought of the bus stop on Winter Street, of 20 seconds, of a trembling hand, of the library card in her wallet, bearing her embossed name even though she had never applied for it, of the brass key resting in the drawer of her kitchen table. She realized that if she told the whole story now, the principal would ask her a question she couldn't answer herself, and that question was why. "I don't know," she said truthfully. Priscilla closed the filing. "Listen to me," she said, lowering her voice. "I've worked in this system for 30 years. No one gives an elementary school on the east side $4,200,000 worth of work for $1. No one. People give money to put their name on a bronze plaque, to secure another contract, to gain votes, to get something. I don't know what this man wants in return, and I will sign any paper necessary to keep this school open. But I need you to understand that there is always a price, even when no one tells you what it is." She handed the filing to Meredith. "Take it home and read it. You were the one who stood up in the lunchroom that day." That afternoon, Meredith remained in her classroom after all the students had gone and read all 23 pages, including the technical pages she couldn't understand a single word of. At 4:30, she reached the final page, where a contractor contact number was printed in the lower corner. She stared at the number for a long time. Then she took out her phone, entered it, and raised it to her ear, certain that some secretary would answer, that she would leave a message, and that no one would ever call her back. The phone rang exactly once. Meredith. She stopped between 2 rows of desks. He didn't ask who was calling. He said her name as though he had been holding the phone in his hand all afternoon, as though for the past 3 weeks he had kept that number waiting in some place known only to him. "You knew it was me," she said. "I guessed," he replied. "Your principal received the filing at 11 o'clock. I thought someone would call before 5. I wasn't certain it would be you." Meredith looked out the classroom window, where the March light was fading over the empty schoolyard. $1, she said. "That's right. Why?" On the other end of the line, she heard wind, as though he were standing somewhere outside. "If you ask me that over the phone, I will have to lie to you," he said. "I don't want to do that. Give me 15 minutes on any day you're free, and I will answer exactly as it is." Meredith tightened her grip on the filing. Unfortunately for her, the answer she was about to search for wasn't hidden inside that man. It was waiting in a set of public records that any citizen of Baltimore had the right to request, and she would find it before she ever had the chance to hear him speak. Meredith didn't arrange to meet him. She told him she would call back, then hung up. And on Monday morning she asked to be excused from her final class so she could go to the Department of Public Procurement building on Holiday Street. She didn't go because she distrusted him. She went because she had spent the entire weekend reading those 23 pages again and again, and she had realized that the copy in her hands was the version sent to the school, while the principal had told her that the original submission was always thicker than the version distributed outside the department. She wanted to read the original, and she had the right to do so, because bids involving work on public property were public records, and anyone who walked in could request a copy for 15 cents a page. She filled out the form at the public service counter, wrote down her name and the file number, then waited for 40 minutes on a plastic chair beside the window. The employee returned carrying a stack of paper 3 times thicker than the copy she already had. 47 pages. She paid $7.05, carried the documents back to her chair, and began reading from the beginning. The first 23 pages were identical to the copy she had already read. Beginning on page 24 was the section that hadn't been sent to the school. The contractor qualification file every company was required to submit to prove that it had the capacity to perform the work. It contained financial statements, a list of completed projects, a roster of key personnel, and at the end, an inventory of properties and investments either held or being monitored by the parent company, Volkov Harbor Trust, along with the date each list had been compiled. Meredith turned to page 41 and stopped. It was a simple table printed in small type, with the title, Properties in the Eastern District, currently under acquisition review. There were 17 entries. Each entry contained an address, a parcel number, an acreage figure, and a column for brief notes. The ninth entry was the address she had walked to every morning for 4.5 years. 720 East Chase Street, main building and rear grounds, 2.6 acres. The note read, "Public property. Possible redevelopment if released by the city. Continue monitoring." In the upper right corner of the page, beneath the title, a small line gave the date the list had been prepared. Meredith read that date, then sat perfectly still on the plastic chair in the waiting room of the Baltimore City Department of Public Procurement. The list had been created on October 12th. The night of the blizzard on Winter Street had been February 14th, 4 months. She had handed him her phone in February, and her school had been on his list since October. For nearly 5 minutes, she couldn't think at all. Then she began to think, and she thought in the precise way a woman who had lived for 3 years with envelopes labeled in pencil always thought, which meant she moved through it one step at a time and skipped nothing. If he had known her since October, then the entire evening on Winter Street had been staged. And she dismissed that possibility almost immediately, because no one could stage a blizzard, no one could stage a store losing power, and above all, no one could stage 8 people refusing before she did. He had asked 8 other people. If the 4th person had handed him a phone, he would never have reached the place where she was standing. She turned back to page 41 and carefully read the notes column once more. Her name wasn't anywhere on the page. No teacher's name was. The list didn't care who taught inside that building. It recorded only 2.6 acres and 2 words, "Continue monitoring." And those 2 words were what sent a chill down her spine, because she understood what they meant. In October, her school had been a parcel of land. It sat on a list of properties someone was waiting for the city to release so they could be purchased. 4 months later, the city had decided to release it, exactly as the list had anticipated, because of a structural report and a figure of $4,200,000. At that moment, everything should have proceeded smoothly. The school would close. The land would be sold. The person holding the list would only have to wait, but it hadn't happened that way. And as Meredith sat on that plastic chair with 47 pages resting across her lap, she understood why. Between October and April, there had been a snowy night on Winter Street. 9 people had stood beneath the shelter. 8 had turned away. She had been the 9th, and she had 8% battery left, and she had handed him her phone. 4 months before that night, her school had been nothing more than the 9th line in a table printed in small type. After that night, it became a $1 construction bid with a 10-year structural warranty. She hadn't saved a stranger in a blizzard. She had saved her own school, and she had done it without having the slightest idea what she was doing. With 20 seconds she had forgotten by the following morning. Meredith closed the stack of papers. The employee at the counter asked whether she needed any additional copies, and she said no, thank you. She stepped onto Holiday Street shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She didn't call him. She walked nearly 2 miles north toward the school, and throughout those 2 miles, she thought of only one question she would have to ask him when they met. And it wasn't, "Why did you do it?" The question was, if I had turned away that night like the other 8 people, where would my school be now? Unfortunately for her, the only man who could answer that question was sitting in a conference room 3 miles away, listening as someone read aloud a list of 17 addresses, and this time he paused for a very long time at the 9th entry. The technical meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning in the Fell Point School Library itself, because regulations required that whenever a contractor accepted work involving public property, there had to be at least one on-site meeting with representatives of the institution using that property. 14 people attended, 2 engineers from the department, 1 representative from the Office of Public Procurement, the principal, and 9 teachers Priscilla had selected herself because, as she said, if people intended to drill into the foundation beneath the children's feet, then, at the very least, someone who knew where those children stood ought to be present. Meredith sat in the 2nd row. She hadn't called him back in 9 days. At 5 minutes before 9, the library door opened, and Augustin Volkov walked in alone. No one entered ahead of him. No one carried his briefcase. He wore a dark cloth coat and held a hardbound notebook and a pen in one hand, and he shook the principal's hand, then the hands of the 2 engineers, before sitting in the empty chair at the far end of the table, the chair no one else wanted because its back faced the window. One of the engineers looked around the room, as though he were still waiting for the rest of the delegation to arrive. Priscilla opened the meeting. The representative from the Office of Public Procurement reviewed the timeline. Then he turned toward the far end of the table and invited the contractor to speak. Augustin stood and said exactly 2 sentences. "My company will complete the work described in the filing, on schedule, with no additional charges." He paused for a moment. "From now until the end of this morning, I am here to listen, while the people who teach in this building tell me what we aren't allowed to damage." Then he sat down, opened his notebook, and didn't speak another word for the next 64 minutes. At first, people spoke cautiously. A second-grade teacher said that if drilling began in the foundation, her classroom was directly above it, and the children wouldn't be able to hear anything. He wrote it down. A male teacher said that the west emergency exit was the only route an ambulance could use, and that 3 years earlier they had needed it. He wrote it down. The librarian said that if construction dust entered the library, all 8,000 books would have to be wrapped, and no one had the staff to do it. He wrote that down, then looked up for the first time and asked one brief question: whether the books would suffer less damage if they were wrapped inside or moved elsewhere. The librarian said, moved, provided there was somewhere to store them. He added 3 more words to his notes. When Meredith's turn came, she spoke about 7:15 in the morning. She explained that 11 children arrived at school 45 minutes before classes began, that they entered through the east side door because the main entrance wasn't open at that hour, and that if the side door was fenced off during construction, those 11 children would have to stand outside on the street. He didn't look up while she spoke. He only wrote, and she saw him underline one sentence twice. The meeting ended at 10:10. The representative from the Office of Public Procurement asked whether the contractor wished to add anything, and Augustin said no, thank you, and the man waited several more seconds, as though expecting something else to come, before finally closing his briefcase. Later, after everyone had left, one of the department engineers told his colleague in the hallway that he had attended 40 meetings like this in his lifetime, and had never seen the owner of a company sit and listen for an entire hour without interrupting anyone even. Once, the other man asked whether he knew who that was. He said he did. Then neither of them said anything more. Augustin left through the east side door, the very entrance Meredith had just mentioned, which meant he had to walk around the rear schoolyard to reach the street. It was 10:20, in the middle of recess. The morning had been unusually warm for April, but the wind from the harbor had just changed direction, and the temperature had fallen within 15 minutes. He stopped beside the chain-link fence, which rose to the height of his chest. More than 30 children were playing in the yard. The bell had already rung, and most of them had lined up by the door, but one little girl was still standing in the middle of the playground, with her hands on her hips, laughing so hard that she had to bend forward, and every time someone called to her, she only laughed louder. He didn't know her name. Then he saw the teacher come outside. She didn't shout. She didn't take the child by the arm. She carried a gray sweater with her, ran across the yard, draped it over the girl's shoulders, and fastened the top button for her, then said something that sent the child into another fit of laughter. After that, the 2 of them ran toward the door together, the little girl in front and the teacher behind her, while the entire line of children waiting at the entrance applauded as though they had just watched a race. The door closed, the schoolyard emptied. Augustin Volkov remained beside the fence for nearly 4 more minutes. He had signed the bid documents on an afternoon in March, among 11 other sets of papers, and when he signed them, he had known exactly what he was doing. He was removing a parcel of land from his own list. He was returning to the city something that should have belonged to him 6 months later. He had called it a decision, and he had calculated it in numbers. $4,200,000 in exchange for 2.6 acres he would never be able to purchase, and he had believed that made things even for 20 seconds on Winter Street. Standing beside the fence that morning, he understood that the calculation had been wrong from the beginning. What he had purchased wasn't fairness. What he had preserved was a sweater in a classroom closet, and a little girl being allowed to finish laughing before she went back inside. There was no column in any table capable of recording something like that. He turned away, walked toward East Chase Street, and when Ruslan Andrić called to ask whether he needed the car, he said no, go on home, and the old man on the other end of the line remained silent for several seconds before hanging up. Unfortunately for all of them, that same morning, in a restaurant 4 miles away, a man named Benedict Orlov had just received a report that the 9th entry on the October list had been removed permanently, and he asked only one question. Who signed it? She called him that evening and told him she had 15 minutes. He asked where she wanted to meet, and she named a coffee shop in Highland Town, at the corner of East Fayette Street, a place occupying the ground floor of an old brick building with 7 tables that didn't match and a blackboard where the prices were written in colored chalk. She chose it because it was where she usually sat grading papers on Sunday afternoons, and because she wanted this conversation to take place somewhere she knew better than he did. He arrived exactly on time, wearing a gray sweater and a cloth coat, without a tie and without anyone accompanying him. He entered through the front door like everyone else, stood in line behind 2 college students, paid for his own coffee, and sat in the chair across from her without looking around the room even once. Meredith placed the 47-page file on the table between them. "I read the original," she said. "Page 41. He looked at the papers, then at her. "Then you found out before I had the chance to tell you. I know my school had been on your list since October. What I don't know is why it was removed." He didn't answer immediately. He turned his cup halfway around on the table. "Because I signed the papers," he said. "Do you know what I have been asking myself for the past 9 days?" She looked directly into his eyes. "If I had turned away that night like the other 8 people, where would my school be now?" He was silent longer than she expected. "It would still be closing in June," he said. "The city would dispose of the property within roughly 18 months. My company would buy it. I would never know your name, and you would be teaching at a school 4.1 miles from your home." He didn't soften a single word. "I can't make this sound better than it is, Meredith. That is my business, and I have been doing it for 5 years. She sat without moving. That honesty was far more uncomfortable than any denial could have been, and that was precisely why she believed him. "Then why did you change your mind?" "Because on the night of February 14th, 9 people were standing beneath the shelter on Winter Street," he said, "and I asked all 9 of them." He paused. "You were the 9th. Outside the window, a bus passed and cast a moving shadow across the coffee shop wall." Meredith looked down at her cup, and then she said something she hadn't told anyone in 3 years. And she didn't understand why she was saying it here, to this man. "My husband's name was Peter," she said. "He was a welder. 3 years ago, I went into labor 7 weeks early. He was at a job site on the other side of the city. He got into his car and started for the hospital, and he never arrived." She placed both hands around her coffee cup. "My daughter lived for 11 days. When she finished, she stopped and waited. She had told this story 3 times in her life, once to the principal, once to someone from the insurance company, and once to her mother-in-law. And all 3 times, the person listening had done the same thing. They had said, 'I am so sorry.' And from that moment onward, they had looked at her as the woman who had lost her husband and her child. Augustin Volkov didn't say he was sorry. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't change his voice. He only looked at her for a moment and said, 'And you were still teaching in April?'" Meredith's head came up sharply. She hadn't told him it was April. She had said 3 years ago. She had said 7 weeks early, and she hadn't named the month at all. But during Wednesday's meeting, she had said that 11 children arrived at school at 7:15 every morning, and she had said she had been doing it for 3 years, and the program from the appreciation dinner had listed the number of years she had volunteered. He had put it together. He had sat taking notes for 64 minutes, and he had listened far more carefully than she had realized. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was still teaching in April." "I know exactly how much that weighs," he said. Then he added something she hadn't expected. "Would you like to know what those 7 words were?" Meredith set down her cup. "What 7 words? That night, you handed me your phone, and I said exactly 7 words before giving it back. You remember. You counted them." She did remember. She had counted them. "You called your driver," she said. "No." He turned the cup another half circle, then removed his hand. "I called the intensive care unit at Mercy Hospital. The man who raised me from the time I was 15 was lying there. They called me at 7 o'clock that evening and told me that if I wanted to make it in time, I had to leave immediately. My car was on its way, but the snow was too deep and the entire area had lost power, and I needed to tell them one thing before I arrived." He paused. "The 7 words were, 'Ask him to wait until I arrive.'" Meredith sat perfectly still. She remembered that night again, but now in an entirely different order. The man standing motionless amid the hurried crowd. The man who had asked the owner of the darkened store, who had tried the broken public telephone, who had walked down the line of people and been turned away by 8 of them. the man who had thanked every one of those 8 people before moving on. "Did you make it in time?" she asked. "By 40 minutes, he said. Then he looked through the window. He heard those words. They told me afterward that he heard them. Meredith remembered his hand when he returned the phone. The trembling hand no one else on the street had noticed. And she understood that during those 40 minutes beneath the bus shelter, the calmest man on the block had been the one about to lose everything. And he had still thanked the 8 people who refused him. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked. Just one sentence. "Surely someone would have handed you a phone." Augustin turned back toward her, and for the first time in the 2 months she had known him, she saw something thin and fragile break behind his expression. "Because if I had to explain why, then what I received wouldn't have been kindness anymore," he said. "It would only have been pity, and I spent those 40 minutes thinking that perhaps no one in this world would give a stranger their phone unless he gave them a reason." He lifted his coffee cup. "Then you did." Unfortunately for both of them, 4 miles away, a man named Benedict Orlov had just received the answer to the question he had asked on Wednesday morning, and now he knew who had signed the papers. The invitation arrived on Friday, and it came the way every invitation in this family always came, which meant not by telephone and with no room to refuse. A server at the restaurant on Eastern Street called the office and said that Mr. Orlov had reserved a table for 2 at 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, and that he had asked the kitchen to prepare the cod the way Augustin's mother used to make it. Ruslan Andrik took the call, and he stood motionless for a long time before going up to the 9th floor. "You don't have to go," he said. "I do," Augustin replied. The restaurant had belonged to the family since his grandfather's time. It occupied the ground floor of a row of red brick buildings, and in the back was a private room with 6 tables, only one of which had been used for the past 30 years. Benedict Orlov arrived half an hour early, as he always arrived half an hour early, and when his nephew walked in, he rose and embraced him by the shoulders, struck him twice on the back, then held him at arm's length to study his face. "You've lost weight," he said. "You haven't eaten a proper meal since the funeral." They sat down. The server brought in the fish, then withdrew and closed the door behind him. For the first 40 minutes, Benedict spoke about the things he always spoke about: fuel prices, the loading contract that was about to expire at Pier 7, the granddaughter who had just begun college in Philadelphia. He poured wine for both of them and drank his own, while Augustin never touched his glass, and both men noticed, but neither mentioned it. Only after the plates had been cleared did Benedict lean back in his chair. "I want to ask you something, and I am asking because I care about you, not because I am prying," he said. $4,200,000 for $1. You signed that, didn't you?" "Yes," without taking it before the family council. "It didn't need to go before them," Augustin said. "I control Volkov Harbor construction directly. I don't have to ask anyone." Benedict nodded slowly, as though that were precisely the answer he had been waiting for. "That's right. You don't have to ask anyone." He turned the wineglass in his hand. "Your father didn't have to ask anyone either. Neither did your grandfather. That is the beauty of sitting at the head of the table," he smiled. "But do you know what happens when the man at the head of the table begins signing things no one can understand? People don't ask you. They ask one another. And during the past 3 weeks, 6 people in this family have been asking one another about you." Augustin didn't respond. "They aren't saying you are wrong," Benedict continued, his voice still as affectionate as though he were advising a nephew to give up smoking. "They are saying you have gone soft. Those are their words, not mine. You have held this position for 5 years. You moved 70% of the operation into legitimate business. You abandoned things your father would never have abandoned, and I defended you at all 7 meetings. I told them, the boy knows what he is doing. But I can't defend $4,200,000 for $1 for an elementary school, Augustin, because that isn't business. It is something else, and I don't know what to call it." "It is a valid contract," Augustin said. "There is a bank guarantee, a 10-year warranty, and an independent audit. I can send you a copy if you want to see it." "I don't want to see the contract." Benedict set down his glass. "I want to know who that teacher is." The room fell silent. "There," he said, raising both hands as though surrendering. "You see? I asked an ordinary question, and your face changed." He leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me. Who you meet, who you have dinner with, that is your private affair. And I swear on your father's grave that I don't care. But when an outsider begins changing decisions at the harbor, it stops being private. A 2.6-acre parcel on the east side had been on the list since October, and suddenly it disappears. 6 people in this family have read that list. Do you think they can't put 2 and 2 together? How they added up is their concern. No, Benedict's voice didn't rise, but the warmth had gone out of it. It is your concern, because you didn't place yourself in the chair you are sitting in. People lifted you into it when you were 29 years old, during the worst week of your life, because they believed you would preserve what your father left behind. You sign once, and no one thinks anything of it. You sign twice, and they begin counting. Augustin studied him for a long time. What did you come here to tell me, Uncle Benny? I came to eat fish with you, Benedict said, and the smile returned to his face so quickly that it almost looked genuine. And to tell you something no one else dares to say. You are protecting someone you can't protect forever, not because you aren't powerful enough, because the more you protect her, the more people look. He folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and pushed his chair back to stand. Then he paused, one hand still resting on the back of the chair, and added in the voice of a man who had just remembered something trivial. Oh, that teacher. Acquaintance. He frowned slightly. That name sounds familiar. I have heard it somewhere before. A long time ago. He shrugged, smiled, and reached for his coat. That is what happens when you get old. Everything starts to sound familiar. Augustin remained seated. In 3 seconds, he searched through every place in his mind where that name might have crossed his uncle's life, and he found nothing. He had never spoken Meredith's name to anyone in the family. Ruslan had erased everything. There wasn't a single line in the system. That surname should have been completely unfamiliar to the man standing before him. Augustin lowered his right hand onto the table, palm down, very slowly, and left it there. Benedict Orlov looked at the hand. He had seen that gesture in his brother-in-law for 20 years, and he knew exactly what it meant. His smile didn't disappear, but it stopped. Thank you for dinner, Uncle Benny, Augustin said. Benedict put on his coat, struck him once more on the shoulder, and walked out. The door of the private room closed, and Augustin Volkov remained alone in a room with 6 tables where only one was ever used. Unfortunately for him, the remark he had just heard wasn't the idle recollection of an old man, and 3 weeks later, an envelope with no sender's name would be placed inside the mailbox of a building on East Lombard Street. The envelope was waiting in her mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, wedged between the electric bill and an advertising flyer. And it was the kind of large craft paper envelope people used for sending documents, thick, without a stamp or return address, with only her name typed on an adhesive label. Meredith opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were 42 photocopied pages, and the first page was a copy of a field report from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, dated April 23rd, 3 years earlier. She knew that date. She knew it the way people knew their own birthday. The address on the report belonged to a construction site on the west side of the city, 4.5 miles from the hospital where she had been lying, and beneath the section marked victim were 3 lines. Full name, age, occupation. Peter Quaintance, 31. Welder. She had read this report once before, 3 years ago, in the office of an attorney sent by the union, and she remembered that it had contained only 6 pages then. Now there were 42. She turned the page. Page 11 was a subcontract between the general contractor and a company called Chesapeake Rigging and Steel. Page 14 was the business registration for Chesapeake Rigging and Steel, stating that the company was owned by an entity called Fell Harbor Holdings. Page 17 contained the records for Fell Harbor Holdings, showing that 60% of its shares belonged to another entity. Page 20 contained the records for that entity. The final ownership column held 3 words: Volkov Harbor Trust. Meredith sat perfectly still. Then she continued to page 37, and that was the page the sender of the envelope had truly wanted her to read. It was the investigative agency's case activity log, printed from an internal system, containing 19 entries in chronological order. The first entry, investigation opened. The 4th, witness statements taken, 3 individuals. The 9th, subcontractor ordered to provide scaffold inspection records for the previous 12 months. The 12th, first extension granted. The 15th, second extension granted. The 18th, dated 6 weeks after the case was opened, contained only an abbreviated phrase and a handwritten signature. Case closed. No determination. Transferred to archives. There was no 19th entry explaining why. She remained at the kitchen table until darkness had completely filled the room, and she didn't turn on the light. 3 years earlier, she had been told it was an accident, that no one was at fault, that things like that happened on construction sites, and she had believed them, because at the time she had been sitting beside an incubator, and there had been no room left in her mind for anything else. She hadn't asked a single question. For 3 years, she hadn't asked a single question. The next morning, she went to school as usual. She taught all 4 lessons. During recess, she stood at the hallway window and looked down at the yard, where the children were running around piles of construction materials that had been carefully fenced off the previous week, and she saw the blue sign attached to the construction fence bearing the contractor's name. She stared at that sign for a very long time. That afternoon, she sent him a message containing exactly 1 line. "I need to see you. At the school. 5 o'clock. He arrived at 5 minutes before 5. It was raining, the cold kind of rain Baltimore still carried at the end of April, heavy with wind from the harbor, and he stood at the foot of the steps instead of beneath the awning, while she stood on the highest step holding the Kraft envelope. She didn't greet him. She handed him the papers. He took them, turned to page 20, and she saw the precise moment he reached the final line of the ownership column, because the hand holding the edge of the paper stopped moving. He continued to page 37. He read all 19 entries. Then he closed the papers and looked up, and rain ran down his left cheek, directly over the scar. "You aren't denying it," she said. "No. That company belonged to your family. Chesapeake Rigging and Steel was one of 19 companies operating beneath Fell Harbor Holdings at the time," he said. "Fell Harbor Holdings belonged to my family's network. Yes. Where were you 3 years ago?" "I was 31 years old and responsible for warehouse operations," he said. "My father remained alive for another 10 months after that day. I didn't take control until February of the following year." He paused. "I am not telling you this to defend myself. I am telling you because you have the right to know who was sitting where and when. Did you know my husband's name?" "No." He looked directly into her eyes. "Until this morning, I had never heard the name Peter Quaintance. In 3 years, that name never crossed my desk. I can't lie to you, Meredith, because you are holding the documents in your hands, and you will find out." The rain grew heavier. She stood there on the steps of the school he had just saved for $1, and she asked him exactly 1 question. The question she had spent 20 hours preparing. "Can you find out who stopped the investigation?" He was silent. 3 seconds. She counted all 3. "Yes," he said. She waited. He didn't continue. "Tell me." "If I say the name," he replied, "you will have to live with it for the rest of your life. You will see it on signs. You will hear it on the news. It will sit inside your home every evening, and it will never leave." He spoke slowly, 1 word at a time. "I need 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, I will tell you. And when I do, the name will come with something else instead of standing alone and bare." 3 weeks, she repeated. "Yes." Meredith nodded. Then she opened her purse, took out the small wooden box she had carried with her all that day, and opened the lid beneath the rain. The brass key lay against the velvet, and the words engraved along its stem were wet with water. She held the entire box out toward him. "For 3 years, I believed my husband died in an accident that was no one's fault," she said. "Yesterday, I learned that someone was at fault, and that someone closed the case after 6 weeks. Today, you are telling me that you know that person's name and that you need 3 weeks. Her voice didn't tremble. That was what he couldn't bear. "I am not angry with you. I believe you didn't know. But you have to understand that I can't stand here holding your gift while I wait for you to decide when I am allowed to know how my husband died." He accepted the box. He didn't say another word. He offered no argument, didn't ask her to stay, didn't call her name. Meredith turned, went inside the school, and the door closed behind her. Augustin Volkov remained standing in the rain before the steps for a very long time, holding the wooden box in his hand, while the name he had uncovered at 11 o'clock the previous night remained inside his mind, still unspoken to anyone. It was the name of the man who had risen from the dinner table at the restaurant on Eastern Street and remarked that the surname sounded familiar. On Thursday morning, Meredith submitted a request for 2 weeks of leave. Priscilla Watley read the form, looked at the blank space beneath reason, then signed her name without asking a single question, because she had been a principal for 19 years and knew there were times when the kindest question was the one left unasked. She only told Meredith that a substitute would take over the third-grade class, that 2 other teachers would alternate supervising the morning club, and that the hearing scheduled for the end of April had been canceled for reasons so obvious that she no longer needed to prepare her 4 minutes. Meredith thanked her and went home. That afternoon, she took a bus north to Hamilton, to the small 2-story house where her mother-in-law had lived for 34 years. Dorothea Quaintance opened the door, looked at her daughter-in-law's face, and asked nothing. She only said, "Come inside. I just put the water on." They sat in the kitchen. Meredith placed the craft envelope on the table and pushed it toward her. Dorothea put on her glasses, read the first page, and remained there for a very long time without turning it. She was 66 years old and had buried both her husband and her son, and Meredith watched her lower one hand onto the paper, as though she were holding it down to keep it from blowing away. "How long have you known about this?" she asked. "Since Tuesday." "Who sent it?" "I don't know." Dorothea removed her glasses. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Meredith said for the second time, and it was the truest thing she had said in 3 days. "I only know that for 3 years I believed one thing, and now I have to learn all over again how to think about that night." The older woman poured tea for both of them. She didn't ask about the man, even though she knew there was a man, because during the past 4 months, her daughter-in-law had mentioned one name exactly twice, and both times she had spoken it far too carefully. She only asked whether Meredith had eaten, and when Meredith said she wasn't hungry, Dorothea stood and reheated the soup. Near 7 o'clock, as Meredith put on her coat to leave, she said she had taken 2 weeks off and would have to abandon the morning club during that time, and she said it in the voice of someone blaming herself. Dorothea stood in the kitchen doorway, still holding a dish towel. "Take the time off," she said. "I can cover the children's breakfast money this month." Meredith's hand stopped at the button of her coat. Then she smiled softly, stepped over and embraced her, and said she should keep her money for herself, that Meredith could manage, that she still had enough this month. She said it because she knew her mother-in-law lived on a pension of $1,100 a month, had spent 34 years in that house, and had never possessed anything that could truly be called savings. She kissed her cheek and walked to the bus stop. She wouldn't think about those words again for the next 3 weeks. That same evening, on the 9th floor of the building overlooking the harbor, Ruslan Andrić placed 3 sheets of paper on the oak desk and arranged them in a horizontal line. He had spent 4 days preparing them, beginning with the evening at the restaurant on Eastern Street, and he had prepared them exactly as he had been taught under 2 generations of masters. "Option 1, he said. "He has 3 transportation operations at Dundalk Harbor, and all 3 depend on permits guaranteed by us. Withdraw the guarantees, and he loses everything within 9 months. Quietly. No one will know why. Option 2, the family council meets in June. I have enough votes to remove him from every position carrying decision-making authority, provided you allow me to speak privately with 4 people beforehand." He placed 1 finger on the 3rd sheet. "Option 3. He is 67 years old, owns a house in Florida, and has 2 reasons not to want anyone reviewing his books from 2013. I let him know I have reviewed them. He will leave on his own." Augustin stood beside the window with his back turned and listened to all 3 without interrupting. When Ruslan stopped, he turned around. "All 3 are good," he said. "My father would choose the first. My grandfather would choose the third. Which one do you choose?" "None of them." Ruslan didn't move. "Would you explain that to me?" "Your 3 options solve exactly one problem," Augustin said. "They remove Uncle Benny from this table. None of them answers why the investigation into the accident on April 23rd was closed after 6 weeks without a determination." He walked toward the desk. "If I do what you suggest, then 3 months from now he will be gone, and that file will still be sitting untouched in federal archives with the words transferred to archives, and that woman will spend the rest of her life never knowing how her husband died." Ruslan said quietly, "You promised her 3 weeks." "Yes." "How do you intend to answer her?" Augustin didn't answer that question. He said, "I need every archived record from Chesapeake Rigging and Steel from 2021 until the company was dissolved. Scaffold inspection logs, internal reports, correspondence with the general contractor, payroll records, and every expense incurred outside the contract during the 6 weeks following April 23rd. The old man remained still. including every payment routed through Fell Harbor Holdings. Augustin continued. I want to know who was paid, how much they were paid, and who authorized it. Ruslan Andrić had been doing this work for 31 years. He didn't need to hear another sentence to understand. A man seeking internal discipline needed 4 people and a meeting. A man asking for inspection logs, payroll records, and authorization signatures wasn't planning to handle anyone within the family. He was planning to take all of it outside. Do you know where those records are kept? He asked. They are in the same accounting system as 7 other companies that are still operating. They can't be separated. If you give those records to outsiders, they won't see only your uncle. They will see everything. I know. You will lose everything. Augustin looked at the man who had carried him in his arms when he was 2 years old, and he said exactly one sentence. Bring me the records before Monday morning. Unfortunately for both of them, on the 7th floor of that same building, there was still a steel cabinet that had never been opened, and inside it lay a thin file that, had Augustin Volkov read it on the night of the blizzard, would have sent everything in an entirely different direction. The records were brought to the 9th floor on Monday morning, in 4 gray cardboard boxes, and it took Augustin Volkov 9 days to read them all. He read alone, inside a locked room, and he allowed no one but Ruslan Andrić to enter. On the 4th day, he found what he needed, and it wasn't in the scaffold inspection logs as he had expected. The inspection logs were remarkably clean, unnaturally clean, because 3 reports from February and March of that year had been recreated at the end of May, more than a month after the accident, in the same handwriting and with the same kind of ink. What he needed was hidden in Fell Harbor Holdings' statement of expenses incurred outside contractual obligations during the 2nd quarter of that year. There were 17 payments. 16 had invoices. The 17th, made during the 5th week after the accident, listed its purpose as legal consultation and external relations, in the amount of $210,000, paid to a law firm in Annapolis that didn't appear anywhere else in 3 years of records. The box identifying the person who requested the payment was blank. The authorization box contained a handwritten signature, B. Orlov. Augustin stared at that signature for a very long time. Then he investigated the law firm, and it took him another 2 days to discover that the firm's founder had served on the advisory board of a state oversight committee until 2023, and that the person who signed the 18th entry in the investigative log, the entry stating case closed without determination, was an investigator who left the agency 6 months later to work for that very law firm. The chain wasn't perfect. It wasn't courtroom evidence, but it was 3 connected links, and Augustin knew that if he placed them in the right hands, those people would find the 4th link themselves. On Thursday morning of the 3rd week, he summoned Ruslan. I need you to do 2 things, he said. First, prepare copies of everything in all 4 boxes. Don't remove a single page. Second, arrange 1 meeting with the regional office of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and another with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland on the same day. Ruslan didn't ask him to repeat himself. He had understood 9 days earlier. He only said, those 4 boxes contain the records of 7 companies that are still operating, 3 of which currently hold cargo handling contracts with the Port of Baltimore. If you hand over all 4 boxes, they will open everything. I know. Can't you give them only the documents relating to Mr. Orlov? No, Augustin said. If I filter them, they will ask why I filtered them, and the entire matter will become a family purge disguised as documentation. I am not releasing these records to remove my uncle. I am releasing them so that a woman can learn how her husband died. He picked up his coat. If I remove even 1 page, then I am no better than the person who closed that investigation after 6 weeks. Ruslan stood motionless in the middle of the room. 31 years, 2 generations of masters, and he had never heard a sentence like that spoken inside this room. This is suicide, he said. Augustin stopped at the door. My uncle thought he was giving her a weapon, he said. He forgot that he was also giving one to me. The 4 boxes were transferred the following Tuesday morning, and everything that came afterward moved faster than Ruslan Andrić had predicted. Within 9 days, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration ordered the reopening of the investigation into the accident that had occurred on April 23rd, 3 years earlier, citing new evidence concerning the authenticity of the inspection reports. Within 3 weeks, the United States Attorney's Office convened a grand jury. By the middle of June, Benedict Orlov had been indicted on 3 charges: obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of records, and conspiracy to bribe a public official. He wasn't arrested at the restaurant on Eastern Street. There was no disturbance, no footage on television. He surrendered with his attorney on a Friday morning and was released on bail that same day, and 3 weeks later, he sold his house in Florida. But the 4 boxes had opened far more than that. By the end of June, the Port of Baltimore had suspended 3 cargo handling contracts held by companies in the Volkov network pending review. 2 banks withdrew their credit facilities. 4 major clients moved their business to competitors. And during the first week of July, Augustin Volkov received notice that he himself, as head of Volkov Harbor Trust since 2022, had become the subject of a separate investigation into successor liability during the period before and after he assumed control. His attorney told him that the investigation might last 18 months, might last 4 years, and that no one alive could predict how it would end. He listened, nodded, and signed the authorization permitting the release of documents. The family council met in the middle of July. 6 people voted that they no longer had confidence in him. 7 did not. He kept his seat by exactly 1 vote, and everyone knew that vote belonged to the 68-year-old man seated at the far end of the table, the man who had prepared 3 options on 3 sheets of paper and seen all 3 rejected. After the meeting, Ruslan Andrić walked with him to the parking garage. "You know I still believe you were wrong," he said. "I know." The old man stopped beside the car door. "But in 31 years, I have never seen anyone in this family do something that brought them no advantage. Not even your father." He opened the car door for him. "That is why I voted for you." Unfortunately for Augustin Volkov, the woman for whom he had done all of this was at that very moment sitting in an office of the school board, holding a copy of a trust record in her hands and staring at a name she had never been prepared to see. Meredith read the news in the morning paper at her kitchen table during the second week of July. The article was fewer than 400 words long and appeared on page 7 in the business section, without a photograph. It said that a 67-year-old Baltimore businessman had been indicted on 3 charges related to obstructing a workplace safety investigation, that the file concerning a construction site accident in 2023 had been reopened at the request of the parent company itself, and that all documents submitted to the authorities had been voluntarily provided by the head of the corporate group. In the final paragraph, the article added 1 brief sentence stating that the head of the group was now also the subject of a separate investigation. She read the article 4 times. She had taken 2 weeks of leave, then returned to school in the middle of May, and throughout those 2 months, she hadn't called him once, and he hadn't called her either. The 3 weeks he had asked for had passed long ago. She had believed his silence meant that he had chosen not to tell her. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper open before her, she understood that he hadn't been silent. He had simply answered in a way she could never have imagined. He hadn't given her a name. He had given that name to federal prosecutors, along with the records of 7 companies, and along with himself. She sat there for a very long time. Then she folded the newspaper and thought of something else. Something that had been resting at the edge of her mind since June, something she had repeatedly pushed aside because there had been too many other things to think about. Throughout the 2 months in which she had taken leave and returned, the breakfast club had continued. There were still muffins on the table at 7:15. There was still plenty of milk. And beginning in June, a blue truck carrying mobile bookshelves had started visiting the Fell Point schoolyard twice a week. It also stopped at 4 other schools on the east side, and no one at the school knew who was paying for it. Priscilla Watley had only said that an educational trust was behind it, that the paperwork had been approved by the school board, and that she hadn't asked any further questions, because she was afraid it might disappear if she did. Meredith had assumed it was him. She had assumed it was another one of his signatures, like the $1 signature, and she had resented it in a way she hadn't admitted to anyone. On Friday morning, she went to the school board office on East Fayette Street and requested a copy of the trust records. Funding records for public schools were public documents. She had learned that in March, at another service counter, inside another building, and this time she filled out the form with a hand far steadier than it had been the first time. The employee brought out a thin file containing only 19 pages, and Meredith sat in the chair beside the window to read it. The first page was the charitable trust registration issued by the Maryland Department of Justice. Name of trust: the Eastside Breakfast and Library Fund. Date established: March 21st of that year. Initial endowment: $1,800,000. Distribution structure. Annual operating expenditures. Irrevocable, and not subject to amendment by any party, including the original funding party. Meredith turned to the second page to find the founder's name. She had already prepared herself for the 2 words she believed she was about to read. She found another name instead, Dorothy Acquaintance. She sat perfectly still. She continued turning the pages. Page 3 contained the registered signature, and the handwriting was the same handwriting she had seen on hundreds of birthday cards, on the backs of old photographs, and on the envelope that had held her wedding gift 6 years earlier. Page 7 contained the list of beneficiaries, and the first entry named Fell Point Elementary School, Early Morning Breakfast Program, funding granted without a time limit. Page 12 contained a clause Meredith had to read 3 times before she understood it. It stated that the trust was forbidden from disclosing the identity of the original funding party in any form, that all public documents were to bear only the founder's name, and that this provision would remain in force forever, and couldn't be removed even by the funding party. She sat in that chair in the hallway of the school board office, and the words from the previous month came back and struck her with their full weight. Take the time off. I can cover the children's breakfast money this month. She had embraced the older woman, laughed softly, and told her to keep her money for herself, that Meredith could manage, that she still had enough that month. She had believed it was merely something a mother-in-law said when she loved her daughter-in-law and wanted to help but had nothing to offer. She had dismissed it in 2 seconds, and during the following 3 weeks, she hadn't thought of it even once. The woman who lived on a pension of $1,100 a month, who had spent 34 years in a 2-story house in Hamilton, had stood in her kitchen doorway and told her daughter-in-law that she could provide breakfast for 11 children, and she had said it in such an ordinary voice that no one could possibly have suspected anything. Meredith held the 19 pages in her hands and understood 3 things at once. The first was that the man hadn't signed his name anywhere. The second was that he had chosen the only person in the world Meredith couldn't refuse, and he had chosen that person because he knew that if the trust bore his name, she would return it exactly as she had returned the brass key beneath the rain. The third, and this was the realization that made her lower the file onto her lap, was the date the trust had been established. March 21st. 3 days after the meeting in the school library. 3 days after the morning he had stood beside the playground fence. 3 days after he had watched a gray sweater being placed over the shoulders of a laughing child in the middle of the schoolyard. The employee at the counter asked whether she needed anything else. Meredith said no, thank you, then stood and walked directly to the bus stop for the Hamilton route without going home first. Dorothy Acquaintance opened the door shortly before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, looked at the papers in her daughter-in-law's hand, and didn't ask a single question. She simply stepped back and said, "Come in," then went straight to the kitchen and sat in her usual chair like someone who had been waiting for this afternoon for 4 months. "I knew there would come a day when you brought those papers here," she said. "I signed them in March." "I know. Are you angry with me?" Meredith placed the 19 pages on the table. "I don't know what I am feeling. I only need you to tell me everything from the beginning." The older woman poured water for both of them, and she began. "He came on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of March, alone, and walked from the bus stop. And he stood outside the gate waiting for me to come open it, instead of ringing the bell twice. I didn't know who he was. He told me his name, and I still didn't know. He said he had something he wanted to ask of me, and that if I didn't want to hear it, he would leave immediately. I let him inside. He sat in the very chair where you are sitting now. He told me that 11 children arrived at school at 7:15 every morning, and that a teacher had been paying for their muffins and milk from her own salary for 3 years, and he said he wanted that never to stop, even if the teacher became ill, even if she transferred to another school, even if she was no longer there. I asked why he didn't do it himself. He said he could, easily, that it would take only 1 morning. Then he said one more thing. If the fund carries my name, she will return it. She will return it the first day she finds out. Dorothea stopped and took a sip of water. I asked him why he was so certain. He said because she had already returned something else. She looked at her daughter-in-law. I didn't understand then. I suppose you understand now. Meredith couldn't speak. He gave me the documents, gave me the name of a lawyer, and said the money had already been placed in the trust account before he ever came here. He asked only one thing of me. Don't let her know. She won't accept it if she knows. The older woman folded her hands together on the table. Then he had the lawyer add another clause, so that even he could never put his own name back into it. Do you understand what that means? It means that even if he regrets it someday, even if someday he wants you to know, he can't do it. He bound his own hands. Meredith lowered her eyes to her own hands. You kept this from me for 4 months. I kept it because he was right, Dorothea said. You would have returned it. You have always been that way. You were that way even when Peter was alive. She reached across the table and took her daughter-in-law's hand. Listen to me say this once, and then let it be. You handed a phone to a stranger. I only signed a piece of paper. That man was the one who had to give away the hardest thing. His own name. Meredith remained in that kitchen until nearly 7 o'clock that evening. She went home, and she didn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, she sat up, made coffee, and waited at the kitchen table for daylight, and at 5:15 she put on her coat and walked to the first bus stop of the day. She knew where to find him. In the 4 months she had known him, he had mentioned it only once, at the coffee shop in Highlandtown, that he still went to Pier 7 before dawn, because it was the only time of day when no one called him. She arrived at 10 minutes before 6. At that hour, Baltimore Harbor held a kind of gray light she had never seen anywhere else in the city, and the water was black and flat, and the cranes stood motionless like a row of leafless trees. He was standing at the end of the pier, alone, with his hands in the pockets of his coat. He heard her footsteps and turned around, and for 3 seconds, he said nothing. He had lost weight. The scar along his left cheekbone was more visible than she remembered. You shouldn't be here, he said. There really are people following me now, and they have badges. I know, Meredith replied. I read the newspaper. She stepped forward and stood beside him, looking out over the water. You answered my question, she said. You simply didn't answer it with a name. I couldn't give you a name and leave you to deal with it alone, he said. A name doesn't do anything. It only sits inside your house every evening. I needed it to come with a file people would be forced to open. Did you know the price? Yes. And you still did it? Yes. Meredith turned to look at him. Yesterday, I held 19 pages in the school board office and found my mother-in-law's name on the second page. He didn't answer. For the past 3 months, I have believed I understood you, she said. I stood on those steps in the rain and returned the key to you, and I thought I was doing the right thing because I had read your family's name across 20 pages, and I allowed those 20 pages to tell me who you were. She drew a breath. But you sat and listened to teachers for an hour without interrupting anyone. You underlined the line about the east side door twice. You paid for your own coffee in a place with 7 tables. You didn't tell me you were sorry when I told you about Peter, because you knew what those words turn a person into. You remembered April. She looked directly into his eyes. People reveal who they are through their habits, not through newspaper headlines. I judged you by stories when your habits had been right in front of me for 4 months. Augustine Volkov remained motionless for a long time. Then he took one hand from his coat pocket. In his palm were 2 brass keys. One was the key she had returned, still resting inside its small piece of velvet, the engraved words as sharp as ever. The other was much older, worn smooth through the middle, its head darkened with age, and there were no words engraved on it at all. This was the key to my grandmother's first apartment, he said. She came here when she was 23 years old, unable to speak English, and rented a room on the 2nd floor of a building on East Chase Street. She lived there for 11 years. He turned the old key in his hand. Exactly 2 blocks from your school. Meredith looked down at the 2 keys. When I placed that neighborhood on the list in October, he said, I didn't think about my grandmother. I thought about 2.6 acres and a column for notes. I passed the building where she lived hundreds of times over 5 years, and I never once stopped the car. He placed the newer key in Meredith's palm and closed her fingers around it. I didn't choose that neighborhood because of you. I chose it before I knew you existed. He spoke the final sentence very quietly. You were only the reason I went back. The following spring arrived earlier than usual, and by the middle of May, the rear grounds of Fell Point Elementary School no longer looked the way they once had. The structural reinforcement had been completed in the fall, on schedule and without additional costs, and when the construction crew removed the fencing, they left behind a rectangular patch of open ground on the eastern side of the yard, where materials had once been stored. It took the Parent Association 4 months to turn it into an outdoor reading garden, with 6 benches, 4 young maple trees, and a glass canopy wide enough to keep the bookshelves dry. The dedication ceremony took place on a Saturday morning. Nearly 200 people attended. There was food, There was music playing through an old speaker, and there were 34 third-grade children seated in a semicircle on the grass. The program included one part Meredith hadn't told anyone about beforehand, not even the principal. She asked who wanted to read the first page in the new reading garden, and she asked it in exactly the same way she had asked every morning at 7:15 for 4.5 years. And this time, one hand rose before all the others. Tamsin Reyes stood, took the book, walked to the first bench, and read an entire page aloud from beginning to end. She read slowly. In 2 places, she had to stop and begin the sentence again, but she finished, and when she closed the book, the entire schoolyard applauded, and she smiled with the same kind of laughter that had kept her from going back inside after recess 1 year earlier. At the entrance to the garden stood a small bronze plaque. It bore no individual's name, no foundation name, and no contractor's name. There was only one sentence, chosen by a vote of the Parent Association. Every great story begins with one act of kindness. Augustin Volkov arrived 20 minutes late. He stood at the back of the schoolyard behind the crowd, and no one introduced him, and no one invited him to say anything. The investigation involving him had entered its 11th month, and his attorney said it could continue for a long time. He hadn't sat at the head of the family table since September. 7 companies had separated from the network. 3 harbor contracts still hadn't been restored, and the Volkov name now appeared in newspapers in a very different way than it once had. Meredith saw him from across the yard. She watched him shake the librarian's hand first, then the hands of 2 first-grade teachers, then the school custodian's hand, and only after that did he turn to greet the principal and the members of the Parent Association. She had watched him do exactly the same thing at the meeting in the school library more than a year earlier, and she realized it wasn't a way of behaving when people were watching. It was simply the order in which he greeted others. The ceremony ended shortly before noon. That afternoon, the weather turned to rain, the warm and gentle rain of spring, and the 2 of them walked east, along East Chase Street, passing the brick building where his grandmother had once rented a room on the 2nd floor, then turning onto Winter Street. The bus stop was still there. One corner of the shelter roof was still bent. The iron bench was still rusted in exactly the same place it had been 15 months earlier. They stopped beneath the shelter, and the rain tapped against the sheet metal above their heads. "Do you ever think about it?" Meredith asked. "About what? What if my phone had run out of battery that night?" He looked out at the wet street and shook his head. "No. Why not?" "Because I believe kindness always finds another way," he said. A bus approached, slowed near the curb, then accelerated and continued on, because neither of them raised a hand, and because neither of them was waiting for it anymore. Meredith watched until its taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she noticed an elderly woman standing at the curb about 10 paces away, holding 3 shopping bags in both arms and trying to pull up her hood without dropping anything. Meredith stepped out from beneath the shelter, walked over, and handed the woman her umbrella. The woman said she couldn't take it, that Meredith would be soaked. Meredith only said her home was nearby, then helped adjust the straps of the bags, wished her a safe journey, and returned to Augustin with her hair already beginning to grow wet. He said nothing. He wasn't surprised either. There had been a time when he would have been surprised, when he had believed that kindness was something people occasionally chose when life had made them feel generous. Now he understood that it wasn't a choice for her. It was simply the way she moved through the world, as natural as breathing, as natural as walking, and she had continued moving that way through the hardest years of her life when no one was watching. They walked on through the rain, leaving Winter Street behind, while the old bus shelter stood quietly in the dark, waiting for some ordinary evening, for some passing stranger, and perhaps for the beginning of another story no one could foresee. Some lessons take many years to learn, and this story carries only one. Kindness asks for no conditions, needs no audience, and never knows how far it will travel. A woman who had lost nearly everything still had 20 seconds left to give, and those 20 seconds saved a school, reopened a closed investigation, and returned to a man the part of his humanity that power had taken from him. The richest person in this story wasn't the one who possessed the most. It was the one willing to give away the hardest thing to surrender, his own name, and to give it in such a way that the person receiving the gift would never know, and therefore never feel indebted. We often believe we must have a great deal before we can help someone. But sometimes, what saves a person isn't money, and it isn't power. Sometimes it is only 20 seconds in which someone chooses to believe you on a night when everyone else has turned away. If this story touched you, leave a like so we know you were listening. Share it with someone who may need to be reminded that kindness still exists in this world. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories still to come.